Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are joining us from. Welcome to the talk on feminist protests and politics in a world of crisis. My name is Sohaila Nazneen. I'm a fellow based in the governance cluster at IDS. I work on gender and politics. Before I introduce my fantastic panelists, I want to say a few words about this special double issue of Gender and Development Journal. I'm very grateful to Gender and Development Journal's editorial board for inviting me to guest edit this issue with Awino Oke, who's based at SOAS. The collection includes 20 articles from all around the world. They delve into the current challenges that feminists face and also women's rights activists and gender justice activists, starting from looking at anti-gender and anti-queer backlash, looking at policy erosions, exploring how people mobilize to fight for gender justice and where the new energies are within the movement. There are also articles that looks at online spaces and also the current feminist victories, both in terms of the Green Wave in Argentina or Bring Back Our Girls or A Rapist in Our Path, and that has taken Latin America by storm. The articles also reflect on intergenerational dialogues and challenges to build cross-sectional solidarity. Apart from those, there are a few articles that look at feminist leaders as critical actors, but also women inside the policy space, both executives and femocrats, and how you defend policy gains. So it has a wide range of things that are being covered in this double issue, but today's seminar will focus on the work that is being done by IDS members and their partners across the world. So some of the work are conceptual work looking at gender backlash. Others are more looking at empirical cases in contexts where you have fragility or democratic backslide. We also have, they're not part of this panel, but work featuring from partners from the Action for Empowerment and Accountability program that looks at fragility and women-led protests in these different settings. And also it's been our pleasure to publish student-led research looking at bilateral funding environments and how that affects feminist organizing. Just to flag that the work that you are seeing here from IDS members from both Tessa and Deepta were part of Countering Backlash program, which looks at sort of anti-gender backlash and how it's manifesting in different parts of the world. Let me introduce you to the panel. So we have Dr. Tessa Lewin, who's part of Participation, Inclusion, and Social Change cluster. She also co-convenes the MA Gender and Development program, and she will be speaking on discourse capture. We have Daria Kolela, who it's a pleasure to introduce her, who is a former MA and Gender and Development student, and she's based in Tanzania right now as an independent researcher. We have Deepta Chopra, and next, you're very familiar with her work on unpaid care, but she's also the lead for the program, which is called Sustaining Power, which looks at backlash against women's rights in South Asia and explores what could be the countering strategies for that. After that, we have Dr. Miguel Loureiro, who is the convener of the MA Governance Program. He works on state-society relations and citizenship and also bureaucracy, but we also get him to work on masculinities and women-led protests. Along with him is Jalila Haider. She is a former Sussex alumnus and a human rights lawyer, but she's also the face of the Hazara women's movement. Welcome, Jalila. And last but not the least, we have Lena Carlson, who's joining us from Sweden. She's a senior policy specialist based at SIDA, and she is also our ally in terms of working with us on countering backlash and funding it. So that's our fantastic panel. So without further ado, let's move on to the main bit. So each speaker will have 6 minutes to respond to a question. and then the floor will be open for open plenary questions and answers. Please put your questions in the chat box and keep it coming. We will keep an eye on it, and collate those questions to ask the speakers once they have done their short pitch. So first to go is Tessa Lewin. And Tessa, your article talks about anti-gender and anti-queer backlash as a key challenge to gender equality around the world. And you illustrate and give us different examples of how feminist progressive discourse has been co-opted by different actors in different ways. And you give us strategies of co-optation. So could you tell us a little bit about discourse capture and sort of particularly around reproductive rights and sexuality, and sort of tell us how can we fight back?
I will. Thanks very much, Shaheenbag. So I have some slides. I'm going to try and go through them quite quickly because I see I have more of them than some of my colleagues. So my paper for this special issue is entitled "Nothing is as it Seems: Discourse Capture and Anti-Gender Politics." And in my article, I use Anne-Marie Goetz's definition of backlash as both politics of preserving gender inequality, but also the dismantling of systems to protect women's rights, including discursive systems. And I particularly like this quote from Kelly Bean, who says that language produces material consequences. Arguments create political realities, whether people live or die, have access to power or not, allowed to marry or not, live in safe neighborhoods or not, is very much determined by the language used for or against them, the manner in which they've been defined. There are no shelters for women without the term domestic violence, for example. And I sort of came to this work through an ex-student of ours, Emily O'Hara, who was really outraged that pro-life activists in the States were describing themselves as feminists, which she said felt like a perversion of feminism. And in discussing this with her and then with Shaheenbag, I started recognizing more and more examples of what I came to call discourse capture, instances where discursive formations or existing concepts and terminologies had been re-signified or shifted or mimicked or twisted from their dominant original uses, often intentionally, with the result that their meaning was altered or replaced. And you may recognize this. It's the effigy of Judith Butler that was burned in 2017 when she went to launch a book in Brazil. And perhaps the most significant example, or the most obvious example of discourse capture, is the purposeful re-signifying of gender as an ideology rather than an analytical category, so that we now talk about anti-gender politics. And another example of what I call shifting rather than resignification is in the pro-life movement. And there's a fascinating analysis by Halver, Nabar, and Ziegler about the way in which pro-life forces in the States have transformed their framing of the abortion issue from one that positions fetal rights against maternal rights to one that emphasizes the bond between the woman and the child, a rhetorical shift that attacks the central claim of mainstream pro-choice activists that the fetus is not a person. And this move also then enables pro-life feminists or pro-life protesters to label themselves as true feminists, fighting for the rights of unborn women, which is a resignification of feminism afforded by the initial discursive shift. This is something that we see in the Love Both campaign in Ireland in 2018 as well. And there's an article on this by Brown and Nash, in which they show how there's been a shifting of messaging from vilifying women towards the kind of embracing them and adopting a softer rhetoric. And an example of what I call mimicry or appropriation, another example of discourse capture, is in La Manif pour Tous, the Protest for Everyone, which is the French anti-gender movement, which was created to oppose the bill on same-sex marriage in France, and it's since broadened its remit to defend the traditional family. La Manif, or manifestation, means protest, and it's a phenomenon traditionally strongly associated with the left in France. And La Manif pour Tous not only appropriated the term manif, but also the language of the same-sex bill, which was called le mariage pour tous, marriage for everyone. We see the same thing in Uganda, where the organization that led the campaign for the anti-homosexuality bill that became law in February 2014 is called the Interfaith Rainbow Coalition Against Homosexuality, which is a clear appropriation of the LGBTQI movement's rainbow symbolism. And again, another example of mimicry, but here an use of visual symbols, which are part of this kind of discursive landscape. La Marea Verde, or the Green Tide, who are a transnational pro-choice movement that formed in Argentina in 2018 to support the decriminalization of abortion. Their central symbol, La Pañuela Verde, the green scarf, was appropriated by the counter movement, La Ola Celeste, or Blue Wave, who introduced the use of a light blue scarf to represent their movement. And in my article, I go on to look at what this means for feminists and queer activists and what strategies they might develop to counter this kind of anti-gender politics, and identify in literature, which is still really emerging, and several of us are hopefully contributing to, these three strategies that can counter backlash: discursive, practical, and legal. And where I end up really is that the strategy that requires significant ongoing care and attention primarily is that of coalition building or cross-movement activism, and with this, the shared crafting of a pro-gender worldview, so both a discursive and a practical movement building strategy. And I think I'm within time, so that's me for now. Thank you.
You're more than within time. So let's move on to Daria. Tessa, thank you for illustrating the different strategies of co-option, but also how do we fight back? So Daria, sort of taking this conversation forward, you also worked on backlash, but you focused on Italy, looking at sort of how right-wing political parties co-opted women's rights discourse and gender equality discourse to construct an anti-immigrant kind of rhetoric and a pushback. Would you like to illustrate on what kind of challenges we are facing in Italy?
Yes, sure, Soela, thank you. So my paper, as you said, analyzed one of the ways in which women's struggle are being co-opted by political projects at odds with equality and inclusion, and focuses on the convergence between femonationalism and anti-gender backlash in the Italian context. In particular, I studied the discourse of the far-right nationalist party Fratelli d'Italia, looking at the 2018 political and national election campaign, selected leader speeches, and journal articles on 3 incidents of gender-based violence that depict victims and perpetrators in a specific racialized way. By doing so, I uncovered the mechanism through which violence against women is used to promote anti-immigration sentiment and question the impact of femonationalism on feminist politics. So some key concepts. Anti-gender backlash is a complex and multidimensional phenomenon that can be defined as a convergence among different strategies and actors whose intent is not first and foremost to attack gender equality. And indeed, it comprises the possibility for backlash actors to endorse selected aspects of the gender equality project. While femonationalism identifies the deployment of women's rights to promote racist ideologies, not only by right-wing nationalist parties mobilizing women's rights in xenophobic campaign, but also by a minority of feminists claiming that some culture and religion oppress women. So the paper shows how, under the guise of promoting gender equality, neo-nationalist discourses draw from the gender and racialized stereotypes forged during the colonial period, adapting the imperialist narrative to the contemporary context, and framing sexual and gender-based violence in racialized terms in order to stigmatize Black and people of color migrants. Some examples are the central role that women play in the iconography of the nation, either as reproducer of the national collective and boundary markers, white women in particular, and we have an example here in the image of the party leader, Fratelli d'Italia party leader holding the national flag, or as treasure figure and vector of integration, and this is more for Black and women of color. Another strategy used is the construction of other women and men as mere representative of the binary oppressor-victim. So we have the depiction of Black and women of color as powerless victims of specific form of gender-based violence, devailing, forced marriage, FGM, to be rescued through integration, which can be thought of as a new civilization narrative. And we have Black and men of colors that are characterized as violent, uncivilized, and misogynistic. you can see in the word cloud in the center of the slide, the most recurring terms in the description of the perpetrators, and they refer to nationality and the migrant status of these men. Even if it's Italian, I think you can get at least the word Nigerian in the middle. All these dynamics are particularly at play in 3 cases of feminicide that I analyzed and that I selected because they made the headlines of the national newspapers, because they feature what I call useful victim and misogynistic other perpetrators. So we have the honor killing of Sana that shows us how other culture, and Muslim culture in particular, is depicted as sexist and patriarchal, as opposed to Western civilization, whose gender relations are considered more advanced. And the picture on the right also shows another example. It's a poster from the party and shows another example of this opposition between different civilizations. Different idea of what is supposed to be different culture, of course. While in the other case of feminicide that I analyzed, which are the case of Pamela, which is murdered and mutilated, and of Desiree, which was raped and murdered, we can observe the use of sexual images to symbolize relation of power. So sexual and gender-based violence in these cases, and especially sexual violence, is associated with othered men and their allegedly deviant and degenerate nature, culminating in the representation of the other man, the black man, as a rapist, from which to defend white women, whose body become the symbol of the national land to be protected from the intruder. So this evidence allows me to show how femonationalism threatens feminist politics and contribute to the escalation of the current anti-gender backlash. First, femonationalism reinforces racial and sexual boundary between groups and nations, and consequently the stigmatization and exclusion of degenerate classes, a term and a category that was created to discriminate against ethnic groups, but also gender non-conforming persons. Promotes domestic values and traditional roles for women and men, reinforcing patriarchy, heteronormativity, and hegemonic masculinity, reshape the understanding of women's rights and the gender equality issues in rationalized terms, and by doing so, downplays the lack of gender equality in Western society, isolate the debate around violence against women, preventing solidarity among gender equality struggles, and diverts attention away from the true causes of sexual and gender-based violence, diluting the meaning of active claims and hindering social justice. So to conclude, these findings confirm the necessity of not isolating the struggle for gender equality and the urgency of dismantling the narratives that use gender as a tool to reassert instead of challenge existing power structure. And it's important for feminists to understand that embracing a universalistic interpretation of women's experience enables non-emancipatory discourses and risks to inadvertently reinforces neo-nationalist patriarchy. While the way forward is to acknowledge the intimate connection between racial and gender hierarchies and engage with anti-racism and anti-heteronormativity as a core values of the feminist transformative project. Thank you.
Thank you, Daria, for illustrating how it's panning out in Italy, also connections between race, gender, class, and immigration status, and how things can quickly spin out of control in the way narratives are constructed, and then gender equality becomes an instrument in the hands of regressive forces. Moving on from that to Deepta, to a context where we are witnessing democratic backslide and specific targeting of minority populations. So Deepta, my question to you is, of course, despite this kind of backslide and minority populations being targeted, people are fighting back, particularly minority women are fighting back, and others are joining forces with them. So could you tell us a little bit about your research on Shaheenbag protests in Delhi last year and against India's discriminatory citizenship law? And how did the movement sort of construct or build cross-sectional and intergenerational solidarity to counter the pushback?
Thanks, Sahela. It's interesting. I'm actually sitting in the land of Faiz Ahmad Faiz, who is a Pakistani Marxist poet who, his one of his famous poets, and that's what my article starts with is and ends with. It also is the line "Bol ki lab azad hain tere," which basically means speak because your lips are yet free. This is so that's kind of like the conclusion of my the fact that actually striking back in itself in the face of democratic backlash is really in of itself, and it's crucial in of itself, because in short, we saw was the coming of women cross identities. The message start with public was all about the first time women protesters, but my research in much more diverse set of Sorry, that was my internet connection. Am I back now?
Yes, you are back.
So, okay, sorry about that. I don't know how much you caught of that, but basically I was saying that Shaheenbag built, there was a diversity of, diverse set of women involved in the protest. And one of the major things that I think they did was to use the idea of diffuse leadership. So there wasn't one leader, not even a and second speaking to, as are you saying, the discourse actually. We saw the women actually co-opting discourse around what it meant to be Indian, what was nationalistic, what meant to have Indian citizenship. And using secular symbols and civic idioms actually drew women over and above, the fact that it was an attack on minorities, drew women from diverse identities into this. I think my third point is really about building rotational shared spaces and an ethos of care. And by this I mean that the site was a sit-in, 24-hour sit-in, and it lasted 100 days, and it was there was a very strong ethos of care and garnering support from women's groups, other women's groups, other. But
do you want to turn off your video? Might
was
give
this
us
kind of like associated one struggle or one leader, etc. And so it was kind of quite autonomous and independent space. The ethos of care really helped in. Again, Sahela, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I was just wondering if you wanted to turn off your video, although we can't see you, but that might give you better connection.
Okay,
and
I'm gonna try that.
Do others also want to turn off their video who are on the call, and then we can come back after once Deepta has spoken?
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Yeah, so so I was saying that the building of these rotational spaces was really useful in intergenerational solidarity, because what happened was that the older women used to come when they were through the night and sit through the night in this protest site, while younger women went back to their families. And then once younger women had kind of like sent their children off to school or brought their children with them, then they would come and the older women would have a rest. So it was really interesting how this rotational shared space, which was very strongly building an ethos of care, care not only towards fellow protesters, but also to people like me, and to the opposition, offering the Prime Minister a cup of tea, and saying that come and talk to us, and the whole idea of kind of conversation. And I think that was very strong. So I will just stop with saying that I think the dynamic evolution of strategies is an important lesson that feminist organizing can take from the Shaheenbag protest, as well as the as I said, the fact that sometimes it's important enough to actually to actually just protest, and the striking back against backlash, and women's coming together and speaking out in unified progressive ways is not only crucial, but actually I would argue imperative. And this itself, this speaking as if our lips were indeed free, can give us new opportunities for change in individual levels, but also at the feminist organizing level. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks, Deepa, and also for highlighting why we need to continue fighting. Sometimes it doesn't produce immediate results, but if you are not struggling and trying to make yourselves heard, then you've already lost, right? It's that continued, sustained struggle that leads to change, and it's always hard. And also for drawing attention to the nature of diffused leadership. We are so used to hierarchical models, but feminists talk about flatter structure, and that has always been something in sort of feminist discourse and debate about how do you build that kind of movement where we all lead in a way. Let's move on to Miguel and Jalila for the next part, which is also linked. So Deepa talked about in a context where there is democratic backslide and minority populations are targeted, and sort of how you build cross-sectional solidarity. So Miguel and Jalila, you're working in a context where it's violence affected and it's fragile settings. And there is sort of violence that's inflicted by the state, but also extremist groups. And Jalila, you are a leader of the Hazara women's protests in Pakistan. In fact, you're one of the faces of it. And Miguel, you have worked on this for a long, long time, and you've looked at the situation closely. So the question to you is, how did sort of women's engagement in these protests change the nature of the protests? And also, but women also face backlash from their communities about their roles. So if you both could elaborate a bit on how the fight is going on for Hazara women.
Sure, thanks, Suhaila. I'm just going to quickly share my screen. Except it says host disabled participant screen sharing. Host.
James, you need to make Miguel a host.
Excellent, thanks, James. So I'm just going to quickly share my screen. There you go. Just to kind of give you an idea, I'm just going to give a quick contextualizing what we're talking about. And here we're talking about the Hazara community in Pakistan, more particularly in Quetta, where you had this historical number of attacks. They are a community that is targeted by different terrorist groups since the 80s, the 2000s. Again, at the beginning of the war on terror, there was a resurgence of a lot of attacks, and this is just a quick timeline. This is not exhaustive. There are many more attacks, targeted killings, bombings, double bombings in markets and mosques and bazaars and so on and so forth. And the interesting thing that we see here is that over time there's a shift of who is coming out to the streets, who is protesting. And initially there was a certain sequence of the men would come out to the streets, they would protest with a lot of rioting. The security forces would bring in, curfews, arrests, even a couple of killings as well. And then we noticed that early 2000s, individual women start joining some of these protests. And then in the 2010s onwards, every time there is a protest, because again, the state failed to secure these populations, you start to have more and more women coming in. And that's what we're discussing. It starts with drops and goes into waves, and it's a full tide of women being present at these protests. And they're not just present, but they actually start leading some of these protests. And there's a very interesting shift, not just in terms of who are the actors in the protest. So it goes from men to women as well. It goes from the nature of it. So it's a male rioting, a kind of anger, you're bringing out the anger of it, where 2011 onwards, you start seeing more sit-ins, more peaceful protests. And there's a shift in terms of the demands. The demand is about justice, is holding the state accountable for the lack of security. Now, the interesting thing, and this is kind of our puzzle, is why are women visible in the protests? The protest leaders are unable to transform their temporary public leadership into more enduring forms of influence. So why are they visible outside, but they're visible inside decision-making bodies? And what we did was we interviewed a series of women protest leaders over the past few months, trying to figure out what's the story here. And I'm going to let, I'm passing on to my colleague, Jalila, to actually tell us what's the story here. Jalila?
Lila, you're
Thank
muted.
you. Yeah. Thank you. Sorry. Thank you, Miguel. Can you hear me, Suela?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Actually, the problem is this, that since Hazara men were part of the protest, but these protests were quite violent from both state side and this individual side. But when women joined it, the whole perspective was totally changed. However, just like other women all around the world who take participation or lead role in these protests were always kept invisible, or their role were like never admired. There are so many barriers, just like the three barriers that we have after these interviews. We have found that one was like, these women are always considered in relation to the men, means they are not considered that women have their own agency. There are stereotypes not only with their feminities, but also they were considered as a mothers, daughters, sisters, and wives, but their own identity and role is totally ignored. On the other hand, we see that these women, since Hazara women lives in the peripheries, like not as a urban women in Pakistan, they are fighting two fronts. Our interviewers, they responded that first that they are fighting the oppressors for peace and security. They are standing, and on the other hand, they are fighting toxic patriarchy within the protest, where the male protesters name and shame them. Like if a women come forward in front of the protest, so they are women cannot sit go in front, but their roles are sit behind and follow men whatever they say, and if they do so, they face naming and shaming both online and offline. And the third thing, that it is intersectional challenges for the Hazara women to be recognized as leaders, just like they are facing in one hand they are facing gender discrimination, on the other hand it is their class identities, poor women, and the ideological challenges that they face. And the other thing is there tribal hierarchies, like the ideological backlash they face is that if you are not connected with the ideology that men holds, is like you are not allowed to share your identity. And on the ground of class, even if a lady is not a Hazara, but she represents so belonging from upper class, they are allowed to do so, but Hazara women are not allowed to take the lead in it. And then on the ground of the gender perspective, just like when I was on Hungary strike and when Chief of Army Staff arrived in Quetta, so a group of male, they rushed before that they come and speak to Hazara women. They went and they pretend that they are representative of Hazaras. These are the barriers that Hazara women within the context of protest they face, and not only face, but they face a big, huge backlash both offline and online in their lives. Thank you.
Thank you, both Miguel and Jalila, for describing the context, but also bringing in what are the intersectional challenges and fight at two fronts, home front, community front, and at the same time fighting in the public sphere, right? So moving on, and this is, as we were talking about building solidarity, it's also about having allies in different spaces. So the last but not the least, Lena, the question is to you. I mean, we talked about the challenges and we talked about the strategies that the feminist and gender justice actors are using to mobilize. But there has been a pushback in the international policy arena against the gains that have been made on women's rights and for gender justice. So how is CEDA working to support women's rights organizations on the ground and gender justice actors and advocate for gender equality in the international arena? Very easy question.
Very easy. Thank you so much, Sohela. So of course, what we see as a donor through our partner organization, it resonates very much with what we heard here today on the pushback towards women's rights organization, the violence, the resistance they meet, but also the discourse capture when terminology is used in another way by the opposition. And the situation, of course, has become much worse during the pandemic. But also on the positive side, I must say that what we hear from our partner organization is how women's rights organizations are monitoring the situation, they're sharing knowledge, they're organizing themselves, and they're also pushing back through advocacy. So we also see that positive resistance. And as CEDA, we recognize the importance of giving core funding to women's rights organizations. And the current situation has made it even more important to be flexible with necessary adjustment to ensure sustainability, the capacity to grow, both on the ground and in policy spaces. And I would say to provide really core funding has made many organizations able to survive during the pandemic. And we also know from that funding to women's rights organization is extremely scarce. It's much less than 1% of all ODA targeting gender equality. So we also have a gender equality action plan where we have made one of the 4 priorities to strengthen effort to counteract the growing opposition against gender equality, and where provision of support to women's rights and youth organization is a key element, and also, of course, working together with other organizations. And what is also, of course, very important is to advocate for support to women's organizations being a key priority in policy process, such as, for example, in the EU Action Plan 2. And just to give like a few examples of what support we provide, so it's both support to research and learning about the backlash, to women's rights organizations to identify the priorities and strategize, to movement building. And as a donor, it's sometimes difficult for us to give funding due to our operational procedures, so very small organizations. So then we support like the Global Fund for Women to eradicate GBV and to Urgent Action Fund. And just to give example of the Urgent Action Fund, so that's also, I mean, considering all the resistance that local women's rights organization face, this is very important. So for example, transgender activists in Turkey have been provided secure housing after there have been resistance from the community and from the family. So there are many sort of those concrete examples. And what we also see, and of course, was mentioned here, the violence and oppression online that has increased, and the way the opposition is using social media now to get their messages across. So we also support organizations such as the Association for Progressive Communication to really support women's and rights and LGBTQI communities to access and enjoy a free media, and to really monitoring the media to see how does this social norm affect the spaces on the media, and how can we work together with the Human Rights Council, for example, to raise those issues. And social and gender norms, I would say, and the hegemonic forms of masculinities are, of course, a big barrier. So therefore, we work together with other organizations and support them, such as the Men Engage Alliance, to really be part and support and be allies to women's rights and other organizations, and to provide SVHR services and to support to LGBTQI organizations. And just finally to mention at SIDA, we also formed a group called the Resistance Group, where we also monitor the situation and we learn from our partner organizations what we can do better and how we can support both partners and the staff at SIDA in the embassies. How will they now respond? How can they better support women's rights organizations? So we have capacity building and learning there as well. And then, of course, we are part of bigger processes such as the generation equality. And finally, also having a feminist government also helps, as they are also prioritizing women's rights and the support to women's rights organizations. So just to finally say, I mean, that the collaboration with the smaller organization, the women's rights organization, and their expertise is also important for our advocacy in different spaces. And we really need to continue to support and even further support these women's rights organizations and advocate for additional funding and for the voices in different policy spaces.
Thank you, Lena, for giving us a picture of what SIDA is doing, but also raising the points about why core funding is so important for organizing and what are the alternative ways of making sure that the smaller organizations sustain, because the usual bilateral funding mechanisms are not able to help, given the processes and the mechanisms, but also raising the fact that like the diversity of issues that require sort of a resourcing, and sort of why feminist governments help. I mean, that was my favorite phrase, feminist government. Probably that's something how we build futures. Having said that, I can see like the chat box and the Q&A boxes are flooding with questions. So in no particular order, I'm going to pick one by one. This is a question to both Deepta and Miguel and Jalila, and it's from Aisha Khan. She's asking, where was it possible to build constructive relationships with male allies when it came to Shaheenbag or for the Hazara women? And if it was possible, in what way was it possible? So whoever wants to go first.
Okay, I'm gonna go because Miguel's in the same room as me. Yes, that's actually a really important aspect of the Shaheenbag protest, was the fact that actually women came with the support, and I don't say permission for a very strong, important reason. They came with the support of the menfolk. So how the protest was organized was that there was a central area in which the women protesters would sit, and then there was the all around were everybody, like mixed, predominantly male allies, and they would come to the protest after work. But also it was very interesting to see men kind of like taking on more roles in the household in terms of taking care of children while women went to the protest, or even cooking, because their wives or their mothers or their daughters were at the protest. And it was very interesting to see that. Now, obviously, whether that is sustained is another question, but yes, it is definitely possible, Aisha. Whether it's like how it can be sustained is something that I think we need to delve a little bit deeper into.
Miguel or Jalila, do you want to pick up on that? Deepta's given us how temporary shifts happened and the issue about permission or support from the men of the community and household.
I'll start first as the true example, the case study of the male allies, which is, and I'm giving it the example right now, which is we just can't control ourselves. So the case, we had a couple of respondents, a couple of these women leaders who were saying exactly this, is that we have some of the men that come with us and they help us organize, but then once the protest starts, they just take control. It's like there's something inherent in us. I mean, all the mansplaining, the gaslighting, we've got hundreds and hundreds and thousands of years of being like this. And it's really interesting of even in their cases, and Jalila has lots of examples of this, of even male allies kind of, it's almost like by default, we just step in. Jalila, do you want to give more examples of that?
Yes, when I see, according to my experience, I have seen that these people are like, they don't accept you at the first place, like they do not allow you to be take part of it, even though you want them to work in collaboration. Like in my example, they trespassed us. They were sitting with us till the last hour, and then we saw on the news that these were went and representing us. So this is how that, as Miguel mentioned, that this is something that 1,000 years of like the mindset that they are not giving away so easily. Like those who are sitting for like 6-7 days with them, all of a sudden we saw them on TV and they are making decisions on our behalf. So this is how that we want to make male allies. We are there for them. Like in Hazara protests, Hazara women are, the purpose of joining the protest is not only to make their voice heard, but it is something that to protect their male protesters as well. However, there are those who are not allowing them, and they are not allowed is in a way that they are not accepting this fact that they can represent, they can speak at their own, or they can be a leader. So this is something that it's a long journey. I don't know how to change this mindset.
Yes, it is going to be a long battle. We'll get there. Thank you, Miguel, Jalila, and Deepta. So there's another question for Tessa and Daria, whoever wants to answer this, and then and it's about feminist positioning. So this is from Susie Jolie, and she's asking: is feminist positioning by pro-life and other right-wing nationalist discourse capture, is that discourse capture, or is it just building on existing feminist discourses? So in other words, what she's saying is, did feminisms already encompass these positions? Because some feminisms have long isolated gender equality and were not intersectional, and at times had potential racist tendencies, right? So she would like to hear your views on that. Tessa, Daria, whoever wants to pick this up.
I can say something, and then Daria, maybe you want to come in as well. Thank you, Susie. Hello. So perhaps I should say that my idea for discourse capture came initially, or at least built on the idea of state capture, which is quite specific in articulating both intention and scale. So the examples that I chose are ones in which I think there is intentionality, right? And so I would say that those positions have been intentionally co-opted. Having said that, I don't think that feminists have done themselves, broadly many favors. And of course, there are so many schisms within the left. And I think that one of the urgent things that we need to do is about that mixture of kind of practical and discursive organizing, and becoming more comfortable with the discomfort of embracing different intersectional positions. And then also, I mean, for me, queer theory and politics makes the most sense in terms of providing an alternative, coherent worldview that one can mobilize against that of the right. But yeah, so I guess I agree with you to some extent, but I also think that many of those examples are a kind of intentional capture. Daria, what do you think?
Yeah, I wanted to add something that maybe the Italian case also can be an example of what happens in terms of capture of this discourse about nativity, and there is a lot of discourse about granting women the right of having children, granting women condition of being mother, but this is at least in this party discourse, so Fratelli d'Italia and other right-wing parties, it's very much linked to the right kind of population, so white women and white parents to have children and to be allowed to work, sometimes explicitly. So they want, I think the leader of this party clearly stated that she wants Italian couples to have children because we are at risk of ethnic substitution, or I'm not citing literally, but it's pretty near to literal citation. And another thing that happens is that there is no engagement, I have to say, it has been announced by feminists, and especially intersectional feminists. There is no engagement with the fact that there is not enough care services for women, which is something in which these parties go, like they found a policy to propose that go hand in hand with feminist claims. But on the other side, there are a lot of migrant women or women that are not granted nationality rights that do this kind of job, and somehow white feminists need these people to be at home with their children to do their activism. And this is also something that is not enough spoken about. In Italy, we have a very flawed nationality law. And so a lot of people, even born in Italy, even grown up in Italy, even more Italian than I am, because I spent a lot of my life not in Italy, actually. So maybe they feel more connected and more affected of some decision that Italy is making at the moment. And they don't have the right to vote, and they don't have the possibility to take advantage of these policies, like maternity policies or benefit for mother or something like that. So I think in this, I couldn't say if this is discourse capture, but this, of course, is a convergence, is somehow things go together. And if some feminists do not take a position against it or do not flag these issues as a matter of concern, they are favoring this kind of discourse. And this is a racist discourse, I think.
Thanks, Tessa and Daria, for highlighting both the tensions within feminisms. Just because we as feminists pursue certain progressive values, that doesn't necessarily mean we are always on the right side of history. And then our intersectional sort of interests mean that at times we are in conflict with interests of other disadvantaged groups, and we need to be aware about where does our privileges come from and what does it mean in terms of if we really want an equitable, fairer future. So the issue that you raise about nationality laws or position of migrant women who are carers, and what does that mean? You know, because there is never, and we know about this, that just because biologically you're a woman or you support women's rights issues on certain policy aspects doesn't mean that you always take everything on board. So there are contentions within feminisms, as we say. So I have a question for Lena, and then I'll come back to another interesting question, which is about online use of online space. But before we do that, this is particularly about funding. So Lena, I'm facing it to you. This is from Peter Taylor. And basically, he's saying that yesterday was Gender Day at COP26. And among the announcements from many countries, Canada committed ensuring that 80% of its 5.3 billion climate investments over the next 5 years target gender equality outcomes. Now, does this kind of financial commitment from a national donor linked to a global challenge like climate change provide a helpful pathway for gender equality? Or is there a risk that it would actually crowd out a transformative agenda? Lena, what do you think? You have insider's view.
I think we need to work on many fronts simultaneously, but I really think this is one of the ways that we also need. We need to have financial commitment. by government in all those processes, and especially I would say in the environment and climate change, which have tended to be gender blind. And we know that, of course, environment degradation and climate affects women more than men. So I think that is important, but we shouldn't only go that road. We also need to support women's rights organization on the ground, and we need to work in policy spaces. So we need to work in a holistic and comprehensive way. I also saw there was a question if we also provide funding to INGOs, core funding, and we do. It's not only to women's rights organization, it's also to INGOs.
Thank you, Lena, for pointing out the interconnectedness of issues, but also the risks of, and why you need to also have dedicated specific funding for women's rights work. So this is a question that's open to anyone in the panel if you want to pick it up, because I know the articles did touch on online space and use of social media for shaping discourses, but also for mobilizing. So what Zunaida is asking is, what role does social media play around feminist mobilization, particularly in the context where whether it can be sort of considered as an alternative to leftist political parties or the progressive political parties as we sort of think. So I know in Pakistan, left isn't that strong anymore. In India, obviously, in some parts of the provinces, it is in West Bengal and Kerala and other places, but not necessarily centrally. So if Deepta or Miguel or Jalila want to take this up in terms of whether social media space is an alternative space, or do you want the mainstream political parties on board, that would be great. And then if there are any reflections from Daria, we'll have that.
Okay, great, thanks. I'll
You're muted.
Sorry. One is that social media was used. In fact, women made use of both physical as well as digital spaces of the protest, as I say in my article, and this was mostly to mobilize, to kind of like house to house, sending WhatsApp messages saying this is it, like come, or I'm here, and things like that. But there were also lots of women who saw the protest on TV and then decided to come to the protest. I also have to say that the protest lasted 100 days, and then COVID happened, and the government used COVID as the Indian government used COVID as one of the reasons why the press needed pushed. And in fact, there is not that much, but there is some evidence that the social media then played a role in taking this as a physical protest to actually kind of looking at singing in balconies and things like that, and then videos of that circulating in social media. So social media did play a very important role in that. As an alternative to political party engagement, just to say that Shaheenbag distanced itself very much from political parties. They've said that they had no political party affiliation. And I know that we're talking about leftist political methods of door-to-door mobilization, but that also has been used by feminist organizations, by women's organizations in the global south. And I think that it is probably not necessarily kind of like an alternative, but it does provide interesting ways in which feminists from different identities and from different locations can come together. Having said that, we also need to be aware of the spaces being co-opted specifically. I mean, and we're now doing a study in Pakistan, and there's a lot of digital a backlash in the digital spaces and targeting and vilification of women activists through social media. So there are social media can play good and bad roles.
Miguel, Jalila, any?
Yes, I want to respond it. As far as social media is concerned, it is positive. It has positive and negative impact both for women activists in this context. For example, sometimes I feel that even our male allies use our photographs, our videos, our miseries to earn more support for themselves, rather to give voice to these women through social media. Like when women sit in the protest, they continuously share their pictures and their videos and see how oppressed these women are, how they are suffering. But when it comes to leadership, they on the ground they just alienate them. However, when we see social media has given us voice, they connected us with other women all around the Pakistan. We build solidarity all across the Pakistan and globally as well. But on the other hand, since again I say that women, if I look into the context of Hazara women, being living under the control of tribalism and ideological, strong right-wing ideology influence on them. If in case someone's photograph is published on social media, there is so much backlash within the community that, oh, she's daughter of this and that, she's sitting in the protest, look at her clothing, look at her dupatta, means well, and like they feel that I know so many people, and even in our interviews, women responded that they felt suicidal to some extent when there was so much hate against them on the social media. And those women who are very expressive, those women who are demanding for their part, their right to expression. So these women are named and shamed so awfully. Like in my context, even though I'm a badass women, but still I feel sometimes I feel depressed. Like they say, oh, she don't wear dupatta, she is a porn star. Like they don't understand that a porn star is not someone who is not wearing dupatta. So these are things like within establishing our mindset within the community on social media. This is huge. And within the tribal norms, a girl's photo, a girl's video or something is like leaking them, propagating them against them is very common. And that's why women mostly, once they take part in protests, they feel discouraged to join it again. Like they doubt themselves when they go home. They feel that either they did it right or wrong. As far as engagement of the political parties is concerned, in Pakistan, I feel it is political parties are still have a strong hold of patriarchy. Like in recent Balochistan assembly, there is no women representative in the form of the we say that within the cabinet. It is that much strong patriarchy that when I personally, when I talk with the male politicians about the issues, sometime after that they start texting me like they think that these activist ladies are like maybe kind of sex worker, or I don't know, like, oh, you like, I want to take you to this place, Europe, let's go together, like these things. And it is hard to express it. Being feminist doesn't mean that it is like it's very hard for me to explain it. So within the political dynamics, it is the process, long-term process again. But I feel that first the change of mindset is very important, and it's a long journey about dissent and activist women. And those who discourage them, who don't allow them, so these people again say that, oh, she's too bold, she is not following our cultural norms, and so many things that they propagate even within the political setup. So I think until women within the political parties, they don't take their charge strongly, I think even women in protest, they can't express as they feel to do so. So this is my experience. I'm talking on experience based that we have gone through. Yeah.
Jalila, you are a badass woman. We all know that. But it's also basically what you're drawing attention to is the harassment and the labeling and the targeting that happens both online and also inside the political parties, and sort of it sort of links to what Deepta was saying, that online opens up possibilities for sort of voicing what's happening and highlighting and sort of creating a constituency, but it also creates particular risks for activists themselves, and we still haven't figured all the mechanisms in terms of how do you protect yourself in online spaces, and it is a challenge. So I'm going to ask our male ally, Miguel, if he wants to make any points, and if not, then I will move on to Daria and Tessa.
Not, pleased to move on.
Okay, thank you, male ally. So I'll move on to Daria, if you had any reflections on sort of the online space, and then to Tessa, who said she had particular points about anti-queer targeting in online spaces.
To be honest, I was reading the question again, and I am quite puzzled about that, because of course the social media and the internet space open the possibility to voice claim, to make statement to people that normally can have obstacles to make their voice heard. So this is very powerful in this sense, but I think this is a huge tool also in the end of who controls communication and of politicians actually. And I've been seeing a lot of politicians also using pretty much social media for statements. So I don't have an answer to the question if it can be considered an alternative to leftist political methods. It's an alternative for communicate, is of course in the end of everyone. You can also, I think, very easily lose control of the messages you disseminate through the internet, because you can post something and then other people can comment it, that attach meaning to that. So it's a powerful tool. It's also in this moment maybe a dangerous tool, but yeah, it's democratic in the sense that everyone can voice claims, probably movements especially.
Tessa?
Yeah, hi. That interesting question. I think it's probably under-theorized, particularly in relation to the kind of connection between it as an extended civic space or as an alternative one in the kind of shutting down that we see of the civic space, but again, not without its kind of dangers. But I think that so I think I see it often more of as an extension than an alternative, although within queer and trans communities there's a lot of evidence of online spaces providing kind of places where prefigurative solidarity can be fostered in a sense, and how that interfaces then with kind of more formal politics or bigger civic structures is a slightly different matter. But I think certainly with some communities it has provided very positive alternative spaces.
That's great. We have a question for Daria, and this is about Italy's development cooperation agency that sort of implements gender programs around the world. And sort of the person is asking that are the development agency and the programs more aware of the range of gender issues and power structures that are on the national scene, or do they perpetuate femonationalism? So I guess in a way what the question the person is asking is that the civilizational discourse that you talk about and the biases that exist in the national political scene, does that sort of somehow seep into the gender and development programs that are implemented by Italian Development Agency?
Oh, to be honest, I don't know much about this program, so I wouldn't be able to answer, like give a straight answer, but I think that, of course, I'm flagging some issues that are happening in Italy, and Italy is a good example to flagging these issues. But this is not just something that is happening in Italy. For example, the academic that theorized the femonationalism is worked on cases of France, Netherlands, and Italy. So just to make some cases, and I think this co-option of gender equality discourse, being it women's rights or, for example, other kind of gender equality claims are being instrumentalized by certain forces. I'm not saying that all the actors in Italy share the same ideology. I'm not also positive that every cooperation agency or actors in the development sector is unbiased. So, I mean, probably they should question these dynamics as well, as every one of us should. That's my answer.
Thanks, Daria. So I mean, we are kind of coming towards the close. So I will ask the speakers, and in no particular order, to give us sort of, and you have 2 minutes each, your kind of final reflections or the papers that you worked on. What was a surprise for you? Any point that you want to raise about feminist protests and politics in a world that's facing multiple crisis. So let's start with Deepta, then we'll go to Miguel and Jalila, and then move.
Great, thank you, Sahela, and thank you for everyone for their really brilliant questions. I think a little bit of, I suppose, from on I think that was really was
do you want to repeat that, Deepta?
Was not the messages of the protest in terms of building. Sahela, can you hear me? Okay, so building an inclusive and diverse society, you know, through this kind of ethos of care, would be really was really striking, and the fact that, you know, it was not kind of like a premeditated group of strategies that people kind of, you know, would do this and this and this, but it was actually came together. And as you know, I started with Fez, but I'm going to end with the Indian poet Majrooh Sultanpuri, who said, "Log saath aate gaye, karwan banta gaya." So it was like, you know, like the people started coming together, and soon we had a huge movement. And I think that was really, for me, an enduring message and memory of the Shaheenbag struggle.
Thank you, Deepta. I mean, not just for the reminding us of lovely poems, because poetry is the sort of the sustenance of life, but it's also sort of, I had the privilege of reading Deepta's paper because I was editing the issue, and I can tell you it is a brilliant paper. I mean, that not just talks about leadership and the different strategies and how physical spaces transform, but it is also sort of drawing attention to the issue of care in movements. And that's not always what we look at when we discuss movements, but how important it is and how people come together and bond over it, which is very, very important. So moving on from Deepta, Miguel and Jalila, final reflection.
Okay, I'll give it a try, and then Jalila. It was reminding me of a poster I saw in Geneva, in Lausanne, a couple of years ago, just before COVID, which was "Let's kill patriarchy and not the climate." And it's very interesting is that without wider shifts in patriarchal social norms, it's really hard for women. I mean, in their case, they are taking on the state, right? In a fragile, conflict-affected setting, they're taking on the state, they're demanding accountability, demanding justice, and yet, I mean, they are being pulled down. We had this discussion that, you know, the irony that one of the main reasons men are preventing women from decision making is because of honor, right? It's because of they're protecting their women. And it's funny because the reason why the women started coming to the protests was to protect the men from being arrested, from being beaten up by the police. And it's this kind of, you know, unless we work on these patriarchal social norms that are deeply embedded, it's a long struggle, as Jalila says.
Leila?
Well, Miguel spoke my words. I think my checking and my observation is this, that there is patriarchy, but there is patriarchy with different forms, more deep when we go to the peripheries. And the problem is not that patriarchy existing. The problem is the denial of patriarchy, and we have to stand and fight against the denial that it doesn't exist. Like when as Miguel said, that we go and stand, because most of these victims of terrorism are men. So we go and stand to call for justice for men, and they say that we are their honor. We are not only honor, we are like we are associated with women. We should not talk political things. A good woman is someone who cover herself very well, and her face shouldn't be visible to other men, though all these are sitting together and calling for justice. So these things have it's maybe for people living in Lahore, fighting patriarchy is 50%, but people living in Balochistan or living in the periphery like Quetta, it is like we have to give our 80% to fight it, and we are not going to give up. Even whatever they name or shame us, we will keep fighting and we will challenge them.
Arya, final words? Arya, you're muted.
Yeah, I was listening to the other and not really thinking what I should say. But yeah, I don't know. This was interesting. I was also reading the question, and some people are flagging that it's not just right-wing nationalists like using. I mean, we should expose hypocrisies of everyone. Of course, this is, as you were saying as well, like feminists also do mistakes. I had issues, for example, I wanted to do interviews for my research, and I had some replies, kind of some movements or some people I contacted replying to me, this is not the way we do activism, this is not the issue we engage with. So the point is, I think what we my main takeover is nothing is as it seems, and sometimes you try to do your best and maybe you are making some mistake, and no one is perfect. Just try to engage with as much feedback and as much issues are around you without saying at first that this is not of your concern or something is more important than other things. And yeah, let's keep trying.
Great, saying let's keep trying. Tessa, final reflections?
Yeah, I guess, I mean, in response to Susie, Yoka, and Lisbeth as well, a kind of acknowledgement that that the erosion of the gender agenda in a sense happens both from the left and the right, and that exposing hypocrisies, as you say, Yoka, is a really important thing to do. and ultimately thinking about the fact that gender inequality is a choice, right? And the preservation of it is an active project. And that, in nodding to you, Jalila, and what you were saying, that anti-gender actors continue to present this inequality as a fact of life, right, rather than a regime that systematically benefits some people over others. And I think in relation to other social inequities, there is a very urgent need to work out how we organize and build solidarity, feminist solidarities, in a plural way. And I don't think it's something that we've done particularly well. And Meenakshi, maybe a nod to your question as well, as academics, how we kind of maintain nuanced readings of politics as well as pluralism in the face of populism, in the place of kind of the way that the social media flattens messaging, and also in the face of cancel culture. Yes.
Thank you.
Hella, back to you.
And Lena, last words or reflections.
Thank you so much. It's been really, really rich and interesting. And there's so much I want to say to reflect on everything, but I just select a few points. And I think the most important for me is the patriarchal structures and the unequal power relations, that it really affects all of us. Also me sitting at SIDA, I mean, we are part of a greater power structure, and we need to recognize that. And also in relation to our partners, of course, we are donors and recipients, even though we try to have as equal relations as possible. And then also you mentioned the care in the movement, and I think that's something we as donors also need to recognize more and provide support to allow more for the self-care. And then also in terms of movement building, to work more together with other movements, the youth movement, the LGBTQI movement, the environment movement, and see. Because we're all affected in different way, but we all affected by those patriarchal structures, and the opposition is not only against gender equality, it's much, much broader. It's sort of challenging the whole democracy and human rights. So we really need to take it seriously with whatever we are working with.
So I'm going to bring the program to a close. Thank you to IDS Communications for facilitating this and making it possible and working behind the scenes. And also to the Gender and Development Journal for making this possible, in the sense that commissioning this special issue. But mostly thank you to my panelists, because it has been a privilege to work with all of them. I have had the pleasure of seeing their work progress over time, but also to be able to read the papers. I mean, with Daria's, it was a pleasure, because that was a thesis that developed into a paper. With Tessa, obviously, this was a concept that she came up with, and we had lots of brainstorms about it, and to see this concept develop is fantastic. With Deepta's paper, I mean, this is something that she sort of said, this is happening in real life, and I want to research Shaheenbag, and to take that initiative and then to bring it forward in a fantastic way has been great. And with Miguel and Jalila, I knew that they were working on this, and I kind of arm twisted both of them to do this paper in such a short time, and they all delivered. Deepta and Tessa's paper will be open access, because thanks to SIDA for ensuring that we could have open access papers. With others, Oxfam has a way of accessing these, so watch the space. The issue will be out end of November. And thank you to Lena for joining us and bringing us the insider's perspective from what donors see, because for us, that's a very different world, but something that we need to understand. And thank you for funding the Countering Backlash program, that enabled us to do some of the research and gave us that space. And thank you to all our participants who posed fantastic and inspiring questions and pushed us to think beyond, and also the connections. So thank you all so much. So have a great rest of this day and stay safe. And hopefully we see you soon for other IDEAS events. Thank you.